Welcome to Will the Neighbor Dog Ever Stop Barking, where I talk about and show you how to repair this Konica 35mm f2 lens. This is the Konica 35mm f2. It's an AR mount lens for automatic index. Basically, that means that it can meter on the camera with the lens attached. This was produced from 1971 through 1987. This is an earlier model. You can tell by the metal focusing ring. Later models had a rubber focusing ring. I believe that cut down a little bit on the weight as well. It's definitely a heavier lens, no matter which version you have. So this one weighs about 320 grams, so not a light lens. It's about 11.3 ounces, or just shy of a pound, about 7/10 of a pound. But it has quite a bit of metal, as you might be able to tell, and quite a bit of glass in this as well. It has 9 elements, or pieces of glass in it, and arranged in 7 groups. So there's the 9 elements, and then the groupings, which could be individual elements or a cemented element. For example, 3 and 4 here composes what on this diagram here I drew up is group 3. So again, a lot of metal and glass crammed into these things. This particular lens I got for a relatively good price because it had some issues. The focus was not anywhere near as smooth as what you see here. It was very stiff and would it would go and then it'd stop. So definitely something going on inside there. The infinity focus, basically when you focus to infinity, that's when you would focus on like landscape or basically anything in the distance. That was not focused to infinity. In fact, it was focused probably around like 60 feet away, just based on testing. And then the other thing that happened is when I focused it all the way to minimum focus, which is just past or a little bit closer than 1 foot. You can see by the yellow marking there, or 0.3 meters. It basically skipped the track inside of it that prevents this front section from rotating the entire lens. It kind of just moves forward and back, what's called a helicoid, which necessitated taking apart the entire lens to fix that. And again, that was probably due to the infinity focus being set rather off by whoever tried to repair this lens last. So, enough rambling about that. If you're curious about this lens or other Konica lenses, or just the Konica cameras in general, I recommend checking out Konica Files. I'll put a link in the description. It has some really good history on these lenses. It's probably the most comprehensive site or collection of Konica literature and just information that I've found. So again, in the description, if you're curious about just looking at these lenses and getting a little bit of gear acquisition syndrome. But go and set this aside, and then we'll get on to what tools I use to do a refurbish and repair of this lens. Okay, first things first, I recommend some nitrile gloves. It just prevents skin oils and fingerprints and dust that your fingerprints or other skin cracks and creases may transfer to the lens or the other parts. As you might imagine, not that great to have dust inside of a lens, especially after you fix it up. You go and look through the glass and realize there's a big piece of lint or a fingerprint or something in there, and you have to take it apart and clean that. So, next thing that I would recommend is a good pair of precision screwdrivers. These are made by Vessel. These are flathead screwdrivers. I prefer these over the bit drivers, even though that's what I start out with. There's nothing wrong with those if you're just starting out, but these will definitely have a more precise fit, and they're a little bit stronger material, the blades or the heads of these, that I found compared to bit drivers, at least the ones that I have, where sometimes they would even chip, and then you have more of a awl instead of a screwdriver. So something to be aware of. So I have flathead, and I also have JIS, which I want to say is Japanese industry standard. Don't quote me on that. But it's a slightly different cross head. I don't know the exact difference of these compared to Phillips, but I believe the screws for JIS, or the JIS screws, it's sunk in a little bit deeper, so these have a little bit more of a point, whereas a Phillips head cross head screw, those are a little bit more shallow. So if you try to use a Phillips screwdriver on a JIS screw, you're most likely going to strip the screw. So I recommend at least getting some JIS bits if you're going to work on Japanese lenses or cameras. Next thing, you've probably seen these. These are lens spanners. These are the kind of sliding, most common type. They do the job. One of the issues with them that I've found is, let's say you set it to the position that you want. It's very easy to have it expand or contract if you put too much pressure on it, just by nature design. You can't really tighten these thumb screws down, and then even these kind of Allen keys or hex head screws on here, they don't get tight enough against the smooth metal unless you want to, kind of gouge it. So they make ones that are kind of like a compass. I don't have one, but while you're drawing compasses, it works very much the same way, and it's just two sharp prongs similar to what's on the end of this lens spanner here. But because there's no sliding action, it works like a triangle, or in this case a compass. It's very sturdy, a lot more robust as far as keeping whatever setting that you want to have it set to. So this is just an example. You do not need a compass drawing tool. But these are pretty cheap. I believe these are newer, NEWER or NEEWER. There's a lot of different brands out there. Just look for the ones that have good reviews, and possibly the ones that are not overly expensive. Some tweezers, just standard tweezers, serrated tips here, and then I really like using these kind of fine point angle tweezers. These are really good for either pulling out screws once you loosen them, or to hold a screw in place when you're trying to tighten it down. Organization is always good, especially when working on these. There's a lot of tiny screws and springs and parts. So what I like to do is use film caps here. These are the ends of, or these are just the caps for 35 millimeter film, the canisters that we get with that. Yeah, enough said about that. Some rubber lens tools. Nice cat around here, but I highly recommend these over getting like stoppers or rubber stoppers for test tubes and stuff like that, just because they're a little bit higher quality. I've noticed that while you do get a little bit of release agent, kind of like an oily film on these when you first get them, it's much easier to clean them, and they don't leave any residue, whereas those black rubber stoppers, those I found, just due to how they're made, they never stop leaving behind a little bit of like black marks and rubber on whatever you're working on. Those do have their place and their uses, but as far as lenses go, these are a little bit better, I found, especially for when you're trying to get something off, for example, the trim ring here, it just kind of fits a little bit better on there. So whenever you're using these, I recommend cleaning the edge that you're going to be using, or just cleaning them entirely. That prevents any hair or dust, or even little metal shavings that may accumulate on these. They're kind of sticky. I don't know if they're a silicone material, but they seem to be dust magnets. But yeah, recommend these, and then you can clean them up first time you get them, and then just make sure to clean them before you use them. So actually 2 sizes that we'll be needing here. Pretty easy to size up if you have this lens or are working on it, and you have a set of these. Calipers. These are good for measuring. Usually there's a measurement for infinity inside of here that you'll want to measure with your calipers, just to make sure you get that same measurement when you put it back together. Otherwise, you're going to be a little bit at a loss and have to fiddle around with it like I did, trying to figure out where infinity is, and then the range at which you need to put that so the lens doesn't basically disassemble itself when you focus it to minimum focus. Plastic spudger. This is just one from iFixit. Plastic is nice because it doesn't mar up metal. Great for when you loosen something with, say, your lens spanner. Once it's loose, I like to use one of these to then undo the ring or whatever I'm working on the rest of the way. A little bit stronger than a toothpick. It has a little bit more of a point to it. You can probably tell this one's been used and abused a little bit, but you want the tool to take the brunt of it and not the lens or camera, whatever you're working on. And again, the other thing I would use is toothpicks. I just have them in a mint tin here. Again, something that's gonna take the fall and not scratch up your lens, especially the soft aluminum. And then another thing, cotton swabs, good for cleaning. Just clean around nooks and crannies, get some dust out. But these will leave behind, unless you have some fancy schmancy ones. I know there's ones that don't have much dust to them. These will leave behind fibers and dust, so that's just something to be aware of. Use your tweezers to get the little hairs and fibers out before you put stuff back together. Blower. You could get a blower brush or just a air blower. I like these a little bit better than the brush ones, just because they don't trap dust inside of that brush, and then you can get a little bit more air pressure on these, a little bit more directional. And those are useful for cleaning the insides of the lenses, just making sure that there's no dust or hair or anything inside them before you put them back together. And as far as consumables go, went over a little bit with the toothpicks and cotton swabs there, but another good thing to have are lab wipes. So these are supposed to be mostly lint-free. Similar to the cotton swabs, they'll leave behind some fibers and dust every now and then, but easy enough to clean up with your air blower. You get a box of these if it's like $286, which is kind of a odd number in my opinion, but kind of a must-have if you're going to be working on these. For cleaning, for the lens elements, I recommend ROR, residual oil remover. This is what I use to clean my lenses in general, but it's especially useful when you're cleaning the inside surfaces, you know, the stuff that you can't get to unless you take the lens assemblies apart. Sometimes it will leave behind some streaking if you don't clean it off completely. In that case, just go and wipe off the area again. Sometimes some distilled water helps with that. You just want to be gentle whenever you're cleaning lenses. You don't want to scratch them, even with lens tissue or the Kim wipes here, lab wipes. you don't want to scratch the coating because it might be a little bit softer than you realize. Let's see what else. Isopropyl alcohol. This is just in an eyedropper bottle. This is 99%. This makes it really easy to just apply small amounts to like a toothbrush or to a cotton swab. Helicoid grease. If your lens is not focusing very smoothly, or it kind of jumps around, or it's just very tight, it goes from like loose to tight, I'd recommend doing a full clean of the old grease in there. These lenses are pretty old. They're coming from at least 1971, and depending on the lens, it might be even older than that. But just something to help rejuvenate that. This grease is a little bit pricey. This tube or this tub will last probably my entire lifetime unless I get into lens repair. But it's this is a little bit lighter. It's a number 10. I don't know what the JIS number of that is, but this is a little bit of a lighter grease to where on a long throw lens like this, you don't want a heavier grease. Otherwise, you'll end up with a very stiff focusing action, and then that's just going to make it that much more difficult to focus and may even cause issues with focusing and the assembly of these lenses. A little bit more on that when we get to the actual repair. And as far as general grease goes, usually not that great to put grease inside of an assembly that has glass that you, again, can't clean without taking it apart in case there's off-gassing. I found that this Tamiya molybdenum grease, which I don't know if it has, I guess it's just molybdenum. This would be for like hobby, like RC cars, joints, axles, gearing, transmissions, that type of thing. But I found that this is very good for lubricating some of those metal on metal pivots and contacts. You use it very sparingly. Again, you don't want a lot of this in there where it's going to off-gas inside of your lens and then fog up the glass. But this definitely helps with that, again, the metal-to-metal contact to where it won't score or bind up. And then, again, necessitate opening up the lens again. And I believe that is it as far as the tools needed to work on this, as far as what I used to work on it. So we'll get into disassembly and then go from there. So first things first, front lens cap, and if you have one on there, front lens filter, just remove those. And then there's a little bit of dust on the front element. I don't even know if the camera will pick that up, but just go ahead and use your blower brush, or if you have a lens brush, just clean that off. That prevents it from scratching the front element when you go to remove the nameplate here. So, and as I said with the tools, just go ahead and make sure that the surfaces are very clean. The idea is not to let this, if possible, contact the glass, just because if there's anything on this or on the lens, it just runs the risk of that scratching. But anyways, I'll try to stop over-explaining some of these things, but we'll just go ahead and press that on there. And then sometimes it requires a little bit of back and forth just to get it started, just to see what that's doing. It's unscrewing this name ring here. So that just unthreads along the filter threads, and this can be a little bit difficult if you have a lens that's been impacted without a filter, or the filter rings are damaged, in which case you would have to use a filter ring vise, which helps straighten them back out. A little bit difficult to use from what I've seen, but going back to the matter at hand, so there's the filter ring, or the name ring. Again, just unscrews along the filter ring there. I'm going to set that aside. So you can see inside there are 2 screws. So that holds the, I guess the lens barrel on, and then the filter ring barrel. Kind of all in one assembly there. But before we undo those, you might be wondering, how else do we get into this? Well, this ring here, this trim ring, actually comes off. So take your larger lens tool, and this one happens to fit almost perfectly over that, and it's basically the same thing. You're just unscrewing that ring there. So that comes off like so. Set that aside. Okay, and then in there are more screws. There's 3 of them on this copy. I don't know about the later ones with the rubber focusing ring, but on the earlier ones with the metal ring, there are 3 screws in there that hold the focusing barrel on. So I'll go ahead and remove these 2 screws that hold the trim ring on. You don't necessarily have to remove these all the way. What I like to do is unscrew them all the way, and then keep unscrewing them until, I don't know if you could hear that, there's a click when it kind of seats, and then kind of thread the screw back in a little bit. These Konica lenses, in my experience, are a little bit particular about tolerances and how tight things are as far as when you reassemble them. So you notice that I'm able to just easily unscrew that by hand, and that's probably why they have those 2 locking screws in here, is to prevent this from unscrewing when you go to put on or take off a filter. So once those screws are undone, you can just unthread the ring here. It might take it a little bit, and then that will just clear the lens housing there. So we'll set that ring aside. Okay, so now you're gonna probably see a little bit more clearly the 3 screws inside here. So there's one there, and then one right there. These actually hold the focusing ring to the helicoid. So it's a little bit of an adjustment if you just need a slight adjustment in or out for focusing to infinity. Once you get the lens reassembled, you can unscrew these a little bit and then adjust it as needed, or adjust it to infinity, tape it or mark it, and then adjust it to where it lines up with infinity there. But we'll go ahead and leave it at infinity. This is assuming that your lens is calibrated to infinity or near enough. I'll take a slightly smaller JIS screwdriver here, and then just undo each of these. And this is where the little film canister tops come in handy. And again, very important that you make sure that this was set to infinity before you do this. Otherwise, you'll have to figure out where exactly infinity is. So now that those 3 screws are loosened, the focusing barrel now will just kind of spin around on its own, and then it'll hit the locks for infinity and then the minimum focus. If you look inside here, there's a little notch. Might be a little bit hard to pick up on camera. Right inside there. And then if you rotate the ring around, you'll actually see, where is it? Oh, it looks like it may have come off. There's that little tab in there. You want that to line up with that notch. You might have to lift the focusing ring for that to actually allow you to rotate it around to where that notch is. And then that will let you take off the focusing ring. There's that notch there, and that just slides into that slot. set that aside. So this lens I've already serviced, as I said. So it was already marked at infinity by me when I put it back together and then adjusted it. What I would recommend doing now, if you have a Konica camera or you have an adapter for like another digital camera that actually allows it to focus to infinity, mount it to your camera, open up the aperture all the way to where it's going to give you the most shallow depth of field, and then figure out where infinity focus is and mark it as such. So what I've done is I've marked at the bottom helicoid here where infinity is, and then the top. This doesn't really move around once you set it. The top ring here does, but this middle one, the upper helicoid, this will just go in and out with that helicoid key. So go ahead and mark your infinity here. Go to mark where the infinity lines up on the upper helicoid. And then another thing I'd recommend doing, and this is the reason for the calipers, when you figure out where infinity is, go ahead and make a measurement of this section here between the lower lens housing and then the helicoid rim here, or the lip. And then make note of that. That'll give you a good baseline of what to see or what to expect when you put this lens back together. And then similarly, do the same with the little lip in here, that guy there, and between the inner helicoid and the outer helicoid here. So just like that. You just want to take as many references as you can. Otherwise, you'll put this back together, it won't focus correctly, and then you'll be messing around with it like I did when I was trying to figure out what the issue with the focusing was here. So now we're going to take out the lens and aperture assembly here. I'd recommend doing this as soon as you can once you mark your infinity points and take your measurements, just because you don't want this front element getting damaged. So there's a little set screw here. It might be slightly different on your copy of the lens, but on mine it happens to line up with infinity. So we'll go ahead and remove that. Or you can do what I do and back it out and slightly put back in, but in this case I'm going to remove it just because it's such a small screw. And then we'll set that in our little tray. And then this ring, it's finger tight on mine, and that's going back to the tolerances of these. What I recommend doing before we undo this actually is make a line where that lines up with infinity or where the set screw was originally. So once I undo this, you probably don't need to use your lens spanners on this, but you can see potentially right there where that scribe or the mark is, there's a little divot where that set screw went. And then that's what lines up with that hole there. Okay, so once that's removed, then you should be able to pull your lens and aperture assembly out completely. I'd recommend setting it to either f-stop f16 or your electronic eye or auto indexing. Pull it straight up and out, and then be very careful because you do have exposed glass on the back here as well as on the front. I'm not going to get into taking apart these just because it's a little bit of a pain to put back together. If you do see dust within your lens here or here, it's easy enough to unscrew. You might need to use lens spanners on the little slots there and there to help you get the leverage to unscrew it. And then the back one here, this might require a friction tool, such as a spanner for the, or a spanner for the slot here and here. But again, I've already serviced this. I don't really want to open this up. The other thing you'll notice is there's a lot of ball bearings in here, and that's for the aperture slide. I've yet to actually need to open up one of these lenses, and just based on the service manuals, I don't feel comfortable at this point opening them up. So if you have oil on the blades, you might be able to get away with just taking off the lens elements, leaving the aperture assembly intact, and then with it'll snap close and stop itself down, but gently clean those aperture blades inside with some lighter fluid on a Q-tip. And they're very, very thin metal, so you don't want to put too much pressure on them, but just wipe it a little bit, let it evaporate, use a new one, wipe it again, and then just work the aperture blades a little bit until they're no longer sticky. But we will set this aside. So looking down inside the barrel of the lens, you can see the helicoid key here that allows it to keep that front helicoid and the front lens, or rather the entire lens assembly, from spinning when you move the focusing ring. A little bit cool there. So that's actually what jumped out on this lens when I first got it, when I went to minimum focus. Because it extended so much, it just kind of, let's see if we can do this. Let me get a measurement here real quick. I have this written down, but you never know. There we go. So what I did was when I went to minimum focus, you can see it kind of jumped out there. And it's very, very difficult unless the lens is apart like this to reseat it. So basically what happened is it went out and then it spun around, and it just kind of ground up inside there if you keep spinning that around. So if you do have a lens that feels like it's just kind of spinning the front section here, most likely that helicoid key came undone, or it might be loose, or maybe it actually did come undone. There's two little screws in there that hold that key in there, in which case the lens will need to be serviced. So that is where we're going to stop for the front section here. And we're going to focus our attention on the back of the lens. So move the rear lens cap. And then you'll see that there's 4 screws here, and then on the, I guess, shroud or baffle here, there's 3 screws here. We're going to go ahead and remove these for this kind of tutorial. If I could find the screwdriver. Makes it easier to kind of remove. What I'd recommend doing is also just making a mark to indicate where things went. Doesn't have to be large, just enough to where you can get your the baffle back on correctly. And it'll become a little bit obvious when you put this back together where exactly this is supposed to sit, but this is a good guide to help figure out where the baffle is supposed to go. So this is very, very small screws here. Make sure that your screwdriver at least slots in and doesn't want to, it doesn't have any slop when you go to rotate it. Otherwise you'll mar these screws, and you can tell, or you could see that this is kind of a matte black finish on this, kind of paint, as well as the baffles inside of here. Or the ridges, and that's just to help prevent reflection. So if you do happen to scratch this, you probably want to get yourself a little thing of, I don't know if they still sell enamel paint, but some matte black paint that'll very closely match this finish to prevent light reflecting from inside your camera when you're using this lens. So go ahead and carefully remove these 3 screws here. That one's undone. Some of these screws may or may not be magnetic, so just keep that in mind if they happen to go flying. Might be as easy as getting out the magnet and looking for them on the carpet, or you might have to get out the flashlight and then feel around for them, looking for the little shine. But it's where the tweezers come in handy, is getting the little screws like that out. So we'll go to remove that gently. Just want to make sure that comes straight out, otherwise it might get jammed up, because it's a very, very close fit on those 3 flanges there. So let's set that aside. Okay. And then I find it helps to kind of orient the lens to where your focusing point is at the top here. And just make note of how things look. I recommend taking photos, writing down notes every step of the way, especially if you're not familiar with taking apart these lenses. You definitely don't want to have to scrounge the internet just to find where something goes. So take photos, take notes, take measurements, and you should be good to go. But we'll go ahead and unscrew these 3 screws here with a appropriately sized and fitted screwdriver. Again, these are JIS screws. You don't want to use Phillips because you'll most likely just tear them. Before we unscrew these, though, a couple of precautions. I don't know if Konica used thread locker, whereas Nikon was notorious for using thread locker, to where you would have to use something like acetone or MEK, methyl ethyl ketone, to dissolve the thread locker, and sometimes even heat from like a soldering iron chisel blade on these screws to soften it up. In my experience, I've not had a Konica lens that require the use of chemicals to undo a thread locker. So your mileage may vary on that. Just be aware that if a screw doesn't feel like it's going to come out easily and you fear you might strip the thread, what I recommend doing is using some either model cement, like plastic thin cement, which contains MEK, or using very, very small drops of acetone. And the idea is just to wick it inside the gap here through capillary action and get into those threads to where it will melt and soften the thread locker. Another thing on Konica lenses specifically is they have shims behind these screws. In my experience, most of these shims look like little pieces of aluminum foil, a little square piece of aluminum foil with a hole in them. You do not want to lose these because you might offset the flatness to the film plane. So even though it looks flat to you, it might be shifted ever so slightly by, let's say, 1 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter away from the film plane in one direction. So just something to be aware of. Mine, of course, did not have those shims in it because whoever worked on the lens prior probably lost them, probably thought that they were just little pieces of aluminum foil with a hole conveniently punched through them. So be aware once you take these out, keep track of those shims, and then make sure they go back where they belong when you put the lens back together. Go remove all 4 of these screws. And what you might want to do is stagger them, just loosen them all up in case this has a little bit of spring tension on it. That way it doesn't fling a screw into oblivion when it comes loose. So we'll just unscrew these and put them in that little container. Okay. And then when you remove this ring, you'll notice that there's that little aperture feeler blade there. You just have to lift and kind of slide the, that's a horrible focus there, lift and then slide it out of the way. And then you'll see on mine, I replaced those shims, or the little silver shims with copper washers that I had from other lenses and cameras. I've not noticed an issue with focus or the flatness of the film plane, but best to use what the manufacturer put in these when they put these lenses together. And you'll notice that they're kind of staying in place. I use a little bit of grease to hold those in place so that way they're not sliding around when you take the back off or go to put it back on, especially because when you put this back on, sometimes they're a little bit offset from those holes, and then you don't realize that you have a shim just kind of floating around inside of here and potentially gumming up the mechanism. So set that aside. There's 4 screws. I don't know if the shims are specific to their screw hole locations, but again, take measurements, take reference. I would recommend trying to match the shims exactly to where they came from, just in the off chance that there are tolerance that you may not notice. So now we are inside the rear of the lens, so you can see how the aperture, or the automatic aperture lock there works. There's a little tooth that clicks down, and then that button is what allows you to unlock it and then rotate through your manual aperture settings there. And then once it goes into automatic aperture, it clicks in and again just kind of locks in there. So we'll orient this to where the focus point's at the top. Another thing you'll notice is as you rotate the aperture, this bar, I guess we'll call it, rotates around inside, and you'll notice that it can move your little aperture ring inside here, and it acts as a stop. So as you open your lens up, so this would be f16, if you open it up to f2, that lens can no longer stop down. But as you go towards f16 here, now the lens will stop down. So this would be spring-loaded from the aperture assembly inside the lens. And then these 2 screws here and here, those are for your click stops on your aperture ring. One of them, this guy here, I made a little note to myself. This controls your full aperture clicks. So that'd be going, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and 16. This one on the opposite side, so the one closest to the aperture scale, that's your full stops. The opposite one is going to be for the half clicks. So those would be your intermediary between 2, 2.8, and in between 2.8 and 4, and so on. So a little bit of adjustment you can do, or you can remove one or both entirely. I know some people don't like intermediary click stops, and some people don't like click stops at all. So if you really don't want to have click stops on your lens, you can remove these screws, and then there's a spring and a ball bearing underneath them that give you that feedback there. If you like what the aperture ring feels like, I'd recommend noting how many turns it takes to unscrew these to where they're unseated, and then note that down. And when you put these back in, reassembling the lens, make sure that those are set the same. Otherwise, you'll have very clicky half stops, and then you won't be able to get the full aperture stops. Whereas in my case, I prefer having for example, in my case, I prefer having full aperture stops and then the click stops in between the halfway aperture stops there. Not as important to me, so I made it to where those are a lot less susceptible to slotting in, because the tension on that spring, or the tension for the spring that forces the ball bearing down into the aperture click plate is a lot less there. So there's a lot of explanation on the aperture plate and the click stops, but you'll see what I mean as we get into this lens a little bit more. To remove the aperture click stops, so there's a screw, there's a spring, there's a ball bearing underneath that spring. Just if you want to make sure you have the same feel as before, just note either how deeply set in these screws are or how many turns it takes to come out. And just be mindful of the spring underneath there in case it decides to come out. So I'll do this one first. This is for the half clicks. Go ahead and take that out. The springs are pretty short, so typically they don't just spring out at you, but always best to be safe. Just use a toothpick, pull that out. Very, very small spring. Definitely don't want to lose these because you probably have to cut down like a ballpoint pen or mechanical pencil spring. And then to get the ball bearing out, I like to use a magnet or a stack of magnets in this case. Sometimes they're a little bit finicky. Move that aperture around a little bit. It's in there. Just does not want to come out. Let's see if we can cheat this with a screwdriver. There we go. Here's one of the ball bearings, very small. Again, you don't want to lose these because you'll be hard pressed to find them. Probably be able to use like the end of a ballpoint pen. We might be able to find the ball bearing. So there's the half click out. So now you'll notice if I go through the aperture stops, it only clicks to the full f stops. No longer does it go to the halfway. So that's something to consider if you don't like the half click stops. Some people don't. You can actually disable them rather easily by just removing that and not putting that back in. But we'll go ahead and remove the full click stop one here. So again, your screw, here's the spring, and then that worked rather well with the magnet on the screwdriver, so I'll do that, and the ball bearing. Set that aside. And now we have a clickless aperture, and then it engages with the automatic aperture kind of gear there still. Not too big a fan of clickless apertures, but you know, if you want that type of thing, you could easily do that, and then maybe remove this little guy as well, just so it doesn't lock into place when you're trying to go through, or maybe you want that. It's a little bit customizable in that regard, but we'll continue with the disassembly here. So this guy is what, as you move through the aperture, prevents it from stopping down. We're going to go ahead and undo the spring here. Very, very fine spring, but it's not under a lot of tension, so should be able to just lift that past the, it's a slightly shouldered post there. Very, very fine lip there. But I'm going to undo that, and then you'll notice that there's that guy there. I don't really have to worry about the other end of the spring right here. And then we'll go ahead, actually, I'm going to remove that screw. Just being mindful that there is a spring underneath there. It usually doesn't want to go flying, but if it binds up and then goes under tension, there is the potential for that to want to go flying. And we'll just note the orientation of that spring. Let's see if we can get this screw out first. Okay, so there's a straight end and kind of a kinked end. The kinked end goes towards this little locking screw. That prevents the aperture ring from actually spinning off because it's actually threaded on here with very fine threads. But the kinked end goes towards that screw here, and then the straight end is what latches into that little shoulder post here. So now that that's removed, we can also remove this bar. And once again, we'll set that to the side. So now you'll see that the aperture stop down ring just rotates around freely. And then we will do more or less the same for the automatic indexing or automatic aperture. This spring is under a lot more tension, so just be mindful as you undo it from here. Have a good grip on it and then kind of guide it the entire travel. See, that still wanted to kind of jump around, but do the same thing. Actually, we'll take a look at the orientation here. So towards the outside, I guess the case or the aperture ring, you have the little crooked end here, and then the straight end is what you have to work and put up against that little shouldered rod there. Go ahead and undo that. Screw wants to move that spring around a little bit, but that's okay because it's not really under tension. So take that screw, take out the spring. I like to put the orientation of the springs and they're basically the way that I disassembled it if possible. And then we'll take out this little bird looking thing. See the eye and then the nose. And those two little feet. And then here is the button for the lock. So that just kind of slides out. That gets stuck a little bit, but should just come right out there. Once again, we'll set that off to the side. And then, as we turn this, you can hear it still hitting a lock. And that would be this screw here. So if we undo this, and I don't believe we need to undo this all the way. It's rather long, so we'll back it out and then we'll just put it in there. And then this entire ring actually unthreads. And it's a very fine thread, so be mindful of that when you put this back on. I don't see any reason to mark where it separates. If you tighten this down too much, it's gonna bind, and then your aperture ring isn't gonna be able to spin. I'll just tighten that down. Yeah. So basically, at the point where it kind of binds up, then you just back it off, and then that's where I typically put it. So tighten this screw down a little bit more so it doesn't go flying. So undo that. And then now you can see the aperture plates here for the click stops, held in by 2 screws each. They are identical, but you have to make note of which side is where. I think these are actually countersunk. Make a smaller one here, to where you can only put them on this one way without the screws. To where the screws actually, yeah, you can kind of see there a little bit of a taper on them, and that just lets the screws sit flush on there. You don't necessarily need to take these out. Let's go ahead and tighten that back down. Unless you want to just take it apart and clean them individually. Usually it's enough just to kind of wipe this down with a cotton swab with isopropyl alcohol on them. And then you can re-grease the plate or the ball bearing just a tiny bit to prevent some metal on metal wear. But now, I'll put this back to infinity here. You see these two screws here, actually for the focusing helicoid key in there. So what I recommend doing is putting a finger up against that key so it doesn't fall out. And then I'll just go ahead and unscrew both of these slightly so it gives a little bit of wiggle room. That way it doesn't jam one way or another. And then on the inside, now that that's loose, might not move around all that much. But this is where you might be able to fix a wobbly helicoid, where if you, a little bit of a tap there and a little bit of looseness, backlash on that. But you can tighten these down. In our case, we want to remove them. On my copy, they're two different colors. I don't believe that matters. One just might have been stripped of its coating or maybe replaced with an improper screw, but it seems to work. So on the inside, you can just take that out. Might want to bind up a little bit if it doesn't go straight out, just because it's pretty tight fit. Close tolerance there. All right, and now is where it's important that you have marked the separation points between or the infinity focus rather, for the top helicoid and then the bottom one. So basically the silver one threads into this brass one, and then the brass one actually threads it into your lens mount. You can see the, I guess it's kind of the lens and aperture assembly. But you can see the threads down inside of there. So we'll start with the top one. What you want to do is slowly, very slowly unscrew this and have a little bit of pressure inwards, to where once you feel that want to separate, go around one more turn, and you can see where I've already marked them, but what I do is mark where they separate. So you want to separate them, and then kind of feel around to where those actually will want to come undone. So in this case, it lines up with the separation point of the bronze helicoid, or the brass helicoid rather. So that's where I made the mark there, and you want to make sure that you reassemble it the same way. Otherwise you'll end up with improper focus, and then that thing might want to come apart on you. So just to kind of clear that up a little bit, you have your infinity mark here, and then the separation mark is where it will separate and then kind of rejoin. It takes a little bit of playing around with, just light pressure. You'll feel it kind of clicking once or twice, and then just gently try to bring that back. And if it binds up, don't force it. You're going to cross thread those, I think these are aluminum threads. Definitely don't want to do that. We'll set that aside there. And then same thing for the brass one. Mark your infinity point previously, and then as you unscrew it, you will feel where it wants to separate. Where right about there. And mine's a little bit off, but this is actually where it kind of engages to put it back on. So just play around with it, figure out where exactly it separates, and then make your mark as if you'll fit. So that is how you take out the focus helicoids. Now you can throw these into an ultrasonic cleaner. I typically put them in a glass jar, fill it with isopropyl alcohol, a little less fumes than lighter fluid, and just run it and let it clean off the old grease. But with the marks that we made, because those are permanent marker, even though I used the industrial permanent marker, it will still wear those off to where sometimes it'll just remove it completely. So what I recommend doing if you do put these in an ultrasonic bath, put some clear tape, magic tape over that, and just make sure it's cut to where it's flush and you can just press it on to where it's not gonna make those dissolve and disappear. And the same difference for marks that you make on the aluminum ring here. So then going further in, I would recommend not putting this one in an ultrasonic bath just because the paint is a little bit more delicate than some other lens manufacturers. Notice that the red dot there is missing some of its paint there. Just haven't bothered putting that back yet. A little bit is missing from the focus index mark here. And then that little one there as well. But at this point, you've pretty much disassembled it as much as you need to. The aperture stop down ring inside of here, you'll notice there's ball bearings in here. This is a somewhat fiddly process. If you take off this stop ring, or this little ring here, you don't want to mess around with this if you can avoid it. If it's smooth, leave it. Don't unscrew this, don't tighten it, because the way that this actually sits in here, all 5 of these ball bearings have to sit to hold this brass ring, which I don't believe, you can kind of see it in here, this brass ring here. So it could be a little fiddly to put that back in and then also get this back on there. And on that note, if you do happen to need to remove this and you put it back together, make sure this ring is not that tight. You'll probably have noticed that there's some sealant on here. It might be something akin to like Pliobond, some sort of adhesive. And the reason for that is, once again, the tolerance on this are pretty tight to where if this is too tight, this ring will actually grind, and then the spring-loaded action of the aperture assembly, this guy, this will not be enough to overcome that friction, and you'll end up with a sticky aperture. So if that does happen, you'll have to kind of toy around with this to where it is seated, but just barely. Doesn't have to be finger tight. You can see that I can just very easily move that with my tweezers. And it might be worth putting some more adhesive of some sort into those areas to make sure this doesn't unscrew, but I'm not too worried about it. The main concern, and I've actually messed this up, there we go, is to make sure that these move very, very freely. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. And again, it's just due to the tight tolerances of these where if you tighten this down to where you think you might want to have it seated, it's going to bind up this ring here. enough about that. So from here, this is where you would clean out the old grease. I'd recommend using either lighter fluid or isopropyl alcohol. Just put it on a cotton swab. Follow the threading of this to where it brings the grease out. Replace the cotton bud and just keep on doing that until it's clean. And then follow it up with isopropyl alcohol or one more cotton swab with lighter fluid on it, just to make sure it's clean. This inner helicoid here, I don't see the need to put grease on. That's where this one would come in place. You put the grease kind of in a thin film. You don't want to pack the threads, you just want a thin film. You can't even see the grease on here. Barely see it, but the idea is to where when you put these back together, it's a smooth action. And you might want to just go all the way down as far as it goes until it kind of seats, and then unscrew it all the way. And then clean up any residual grease that might show up outside, like kind of here a little bit. Again, you just want to avoid getting too much grease on any of this stuff. These areas are more for the sake of keeping dust and dirt from being attracted to your camera. So once you clean up all this, then you're pretty much ready to start putting it back together. Okay, reassembly time. It's as simple as putting it back together the way that you took it apart, but in reverse order. But more seriously, we'll just walk through it here. So you're going to want to take your brush before you put it back together. So once you've cleaned up the helicoids here, inner and outer, and then this guy and this guy, then you're going to want to take your grease and your flat brush, and you're just going to want to get a little bit on here and put a thin film along these threads. It doesn't take much. You don't want to pack these threads unless you want a lot of cleanup once you seat these and then undo them again. So just be mindful of that and you should be good. You should have a slight glisten and maybe a little bit of the white color of the grease, but you don't want it to be, again, packed full of grease. I'll show you why. We'll put the brass helicoid back in, and once you put your helicoid grease on here, you want to line up the separation point. Do that just by kind of going back and forth until it kind of seats in. You'll feel it click, and just go all the way down, and then you want to kind of seat, and then you want to undo it all the way. And the reason for this, we want to make sure that there's not any excess grease that's kind of pulled up on the outside of the threads on the aperture or the indicator ring here. So a little bit there, not the end of the world. Clean that up with some isopropyl alcohol, some lighter fluid, and then you want to make sure the same for this, that it doesn't pull up on the threads at the top there. You want a smooth action, not something that's gonna get into other places of the lens. We'll do that. Back. This is why it's important to have the measurement for how much of a gap there should be here. So even if you're at infinity, if I were to accidentally seat this helicoid incorrectly, I could be at infinity as far as my mark is concerned, but it would be off because it's further in or out. Because these can engage at multiple points on the threads. So we'll do the same for the aluminum one here. Just want to be very gentle when you seat it. Make sure that it goes down without any issue. And then again, checking that measurement there. That might be a little off. There we go. Okay. Now you got to get the helicoid key back in there. So what I like to do is clean the helicoid key and then clean the channel that's in. Make sure it's not, there's no like barbs or anything, some rough spots on here, because that'll impact the action of the aluminum ring going in and out as you focus your lens. So when you put this back in, another thing you can do is put a tiny bit of lens grease. You can't even see it on here, but just kind of wipe that along the channel where the helicoid key would mesh up with. These faces here, the thin ones, and then possibly even on the back side and the corners. And what that does is just helps with any metal on metal contact, prevents it from binding up. So this might be a little bit of a doozy to get back in. You just want to be gentle with it. You don't want to force it and then potentially mar it. Line up the threads, or the holes rather, and then again hold it there with your finger. You might have to use a toothpick to help line up these screw holes, like so. And we'll just go to put that back in. Yeah, that did not seat. Let's see what we can do. There we go. You don't want to tighten down one of these or the other too much without the other one going in the slightly more or equal. So we'll just gently back these off, let it seat, and then tighten it down and barely seat those screws in there. The reason for that, you don't want the key in here to be cocked one way or the other and then grind up against the side of the housing there. So I recommend just kind of moving it a little bit, see how it feels, and then if you find that there's an area where it's kind of binding up, undo these and then run it through a little bit, and then run it through again. That'll kind of seat it in a better position, and then you can tighten these down a little bit at a time, one and then the other. There's that. Nice and smooth. You shouldn't hear any grinding sound from the helicoid. And then you may feel a little bit of resistance if you go past infinity, just because that's not where the lens was designed to go. But you should be able to go to infinity and then past that without any resistance, other than what could be expected from whatever grease you chose. This is another reason to use that lighter grease, is because it doesn't have much resistance. It's a large amount of focus throw travel on this. So put that back there. Once again, check the measurement, because I think that, yeah, thought that jumped a little bit, but we're good. Okay, now that is good to go, we will put the aperture ring back on here. Just kind of rotate it counterclockwise until you hear it click when the threads seat, and then we'll then tighten that down just past, and then where it starts to bind up, you could even, you want to get this a little bit closer or further away, run it around and you might be able to get it. I don't know if these are keyed, doesn't look like it. Anyways, yeah, tighten it down until you can feel it kind of seating or binding up, and then back it off to the EE or the F16. And then we're going to tighten down the screw here. That prevents it from rotating off and unthreading. Just kind of seat that. And then make sure that it doesn't want to try and fly away on you here. Okay. So then we'll set this to EE and start putting in this little assembly here. So we'll start off with the button. This might be a little finicky. So I want to make sure that little pin is facing up there. And then the feet of the bird, that little lock tooth there. See where those just kind of fit in. Make sure that's put EE. Put this in position and then we can see it. There we go. Like so. Put the spring in and just kind of lie it on top. No need to try and cram that in there. And you'll notice this screw has a couple of shoulders on it, and that's to allow it to, the smaller shoulder there is to allow the little lock tooth to rotate around it, and then the larger one before the head there is for the spring to, again, allow it to kind of rotate around. So just fit that. It might be a little finicky. Take your time and then readjust things if needed. You definitely don't want to send the screw flying, send the spring flying, or especially don't want to strip the threads of this screw or the threads of the hole that it goes into. There we go. Sometimes it can help to put tweezers there. Other times, just back it off, wait until it seats, and then tighten it down gently. Put it to that EE mark again, and then from there, you can lock that. Kind of mess around with the spring so it goes back the way it's supposed to. Just make sure that it's flat. So you can see that spring is now up against the eye of the bird, so to speak. That little peg, make sure it's in the little channel on that peg or underneath the head of the peg. Make sure the spring is flat, and then this is just kind of free floating. And then slowly tighten down that screw, and then just kind of press your screwdriver up against this section of it. That helps ensure that the spring actually can, or the screw and the spring fit together and it's not going to bind up. So you can test that and just make sure that it's working as it's supposed to. See that it clicks into place, prevents it, and then moves around freely. Then we'll do the same with the aperture bar. And again, we'll just make sure that this is spinning freely. We definitely don't want that binding up. Seems a little bit There we go. You'll definitely get a feel for it. Again, very, very tight tolerances on these. So go ahead and put the bar back in here. It's kind of obvious where it goes just based on its shape and that little screw hole there. The spring goes back in here. And the kinked end, like we talked about earlier, that goes up against this guy here. You might have to kind of fiddle around with how it gets placed. So then you can put the spring or the screw on top of it. You just want to avoid messing up the spring there. Might be a little fiddly. So you can lie it like this to where it's up against the black portion of the aperture ring. And just make sure you don't tighten down the screw too much. You just want to get it started on those threads. And then once it's started and not going to fly off, make sure that spring is in place. And then kind of move it. You might even be able to just put it up against the post here, like so. Just gonna put my finger over that so it doesn't go flying on my thumb, and then tighten it down. And again, same with the little lock here. Make sure that the spring is actually allowing that screw to go all the way down. It's not as much movement on this here, but you definitely want to make sure that when you might not even be able to see that action. Very, very little movement here. And that's what you want to see as you tighten this down. You just want to seat it and then make sure that it still has that little bit of wiggle room for that spring to act against. All right, so we'll go ahead and set this to EE again. Hold on 1 second. There's a little bit of a resistance here. Sometimes these springs like to rub up against, so you'll notice that F2, it'll want to kind of almost lock into place, so you have to play around with this guy. It's usually the culprit. There we go. Okay. You just want to make sure that this is a smooth action and not kind of clicking into place. You want this one to click into place. You don't necessarily want the F2 stop to have some resistance and then click into place after 2.8. That makes sense. We'll put this back to EE since that's going to lock it. We'll grab our ball bearings. It doesn't hurt to put a tiny little bit of grease on these before you drop them in. I recommend doing this one at a time. So the ball bearing, the spring, and then the screw that goes on top of that. And we'll back it off to where it seats, and then we'll tighten it down. And then with respect to where it was or how you want it adjusted. And I prefer my full click stops to be a little bit more pronounced, but we'll set that to where it's just flush with the ring here. And then we'll put the other ball bearing in. Put the other spring in. And the screw. Back it off to where the screw seats. Put it down. And then the half, I like to make it flush and then give it about a half turn. Maybe a quarter turn there. And then this one, let's see, so that's about flush. I'll do half and 1 and a quarter. See how that feels. Yeah. Very distinct full stops, and then you can still, if you're gentle with it, get those half stops, but I typically don't use the half stops. All right. Now, I'll go ahead and put the lever, I'll put that back to EE. We'll put the aperture stop down lever all the way that way. And then we'll grab our mount bracket plate here, or our lens mount plate. And again, you want to make sure that you have your shims. These are going to be on your lens, most likely little silver foil looking shims or washers. They might even be rectangular. Use a little bit of grease, just kind of stick them in place to where they're not going to want to fly around. And then go ahead and put this on. It might help to use this baffle as a reference with the mark we made, just to figure out where that's supposed to go. Like so. All right, grab those screws. It's pretty easy to see if the shims or your washers have gone out of place, and then kind of manipulate them back into place with a toothpick. Just put these back in. Just seating these and tightening them down a little bit to where those shims don't want to go flying around inside, but not enough to where it's completely tightened down. Because you want to do this in kind of a crisscross pattern. Once you tighten that down, that is. All right, there's that. And just for orientation, there's our focus. So we'll start with this guy. Put him down to where he's just barely seated, and then we'll do the one across furthest away. Tighten down to where it's seated, and then you could do the left or the right, but just kind of memorize your pattern. So do that, 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 and that, and then we'll go this one, tighten that down just a little bit more, tighten this one down a little bit more, this one, and this one, and so forth. You don't want to smoke these and strip the threads. They're kind of coarse threads, so it'd be difficult to do that unless you had a huge screwdriver, put a lot of effort into it. But just go gentle with them, tighten them down a little bit at a time. Make sure that your click stops are still clicky and working. I'll put that back to EE. We'll set this all the way over where it's supposed to be. And then we'll put the baffle back in using the mark that we put there. Kind of help with alignment. Should just slot straight on. Want to avoid too much if it's kind of cocked off to one side, because it will scratch it and then you'll have to repaint that matte black finish. So we'll put that like so. Tiny little screws. Then kind of same thing here, just barely gonna seat these and then we'll tighten them down ever so slightly, one by one. I don't believe that I need to do this. It's not as important as the other screws that need to be tightened down, but I'd like to make sure there's not anything slightly off kilter. That guy, we'll just go counterclockwise on this one, since that's what I'm kind of doing. All right. Make sure that's set to infinity. And then now would be a good time to change your gloves, because we're going to be handling the aperture and lens assembly. So last thing you want to do is to put that in and then realize, oh, I've got a nice big grease print on the front of my lens, or the rear of my lens. So we'll go ahead and get that done. Put the rear lens cap on here so it stands upright. Make sure that this is set to infinity again. And we'll change our gloves and go ahead and put that lens back in. All right, new gloves, no more grease on the fingerprints. So first things first, grab our lens and aperture assembly here. Make sure that the ring down in here is all the way, well, we'll set this to EE, put it to infinity, and then we'll make sure this is all the way against the stop, going clockwise. So this screw here has to line up with that little down in there claw. And then you'll notice that there's other slots in here, and those screws, there's a larger screw here, there's a smaller one here, and a smaller one here. Those hold the aperture assembly together, and they also act as like pseudo helicoid keys. Not the best design in my opinion. I prefer having two helicoid keys. Kind of keeps things a little bit more aligned, but that's the way Konica did this. So it doesn't hurt to put a little bit of grease, the helicoid grease, or in my case molybdenum, up against those faces, and just make sure that it's not going to bind up there. So just get that all the way again clockwise. That screw wants to go in there. And it may take a couple of tries to get that in, but once you get it in there, you should be able to adjust your aperture without any problem, and then make sure that the focus goes out and then back to infinity just a little bit. Make sure it's seated, which it is. So we'll set that to infinity, and then once again, we'll grab our ring. And we made a little mark there. I made a little mark there where the set screw originally sat. Just put that on, rotate it back to where I can feel it click in, and then thread that on. And this is going to be just slightly past finger tight. You want to be able to see inside there where that set screw was. You can kind of see the dimple. Hard to see on the camera, but you can see where the set screw went previously. Has a little dent in there. So we'll put the set screw back in. Back it off and tighten it down to where it's seated, and then tighten it just a little more. Doesn't need a lot of strength put into that. And then what I would recommend doing is just kind of move or try to move that ring back and forth. The reason that I keep driving home that this lens has very tight tolerances is, especially if it's been damaged from improper work done on it, the focusing can be messed up as far as the smoothness because of those screws that serve as pseudo-helicoid keys. So if it's even slightly ajar, you'll run into where those screws now rub up against the side of those slots, and then you'll have very stiff or kind of inconsistent focusing. So another reason for the grease there. And once again, we'll set it to infinity after making sure that it feels smooth through a little bit of travel. I'll set that back to infinity. And we will start the rest of the reassembly process. So we'll take our focusing ring. There's that little barb there, or that little notch. And then that, you'll easily slide over that. Then you kind of rotate it, and then since we're already at infinity with our little mark there, we can just put that in like so. We'll grab our 3 screws, and that can help to put a magnet on the end of your screwdriver, like so, and then that will help the screws not go flying inside of here. And back it off and tighten it down, and you want to just barely seat each of these because there's 3 of them. You want to make sure that they're equal. One's not tighter than the other. That's seated. I'll do the last one. Like so. Take the magnet off. And we'll tighten these down little by little, one by one, counterclockwise. Don't go too crazy on this because you don't want to bend or possibly shear the little lip inside that these are actually screwing down into. Okay, so now you should have the infinity stop. If this is working correctly, you should be able to focus it to minimum focus. It should hit the stop, and then you should be able to focus it back to infinity. And that's because the helicoid key inside of there is not jumping the track, so to speak. So that is good to go there. We will take our filter ring. And remember that there's the 2 screws inside of there that kind of lock it in place. Put that directly over. Back it off to where it seats. And then we'll tighten that down. Once again, very, very tight tolerances. So make it just slightly finger tight. Make sure that the focus is smooth. Maybe tighten it down a little bit more. You just want to make sure that nothing gets kind of skewed or cranked one way or another. Once that's good to go, tighten these down. Don't need to be super tight, just tight enough to where the filter ring is not going to want to back off when you go to remove a filter or a screw-on lens cap. We'll go ahead and grab our trim ring here. Put that over. Same thing. We'll back it off to where it clicks in and is seated, and then tighten it. This one could be a little finicky because once again, those tight tolerances, it's just kind of a feel thing. So you can use your tool there, but then once again, make sure that it's focusing smoothly through the entire range. And then finally, we'll put the lens name ring in here, and then use our lens tool. Tighten that down. Everything went correctly. We should have a fully serviced and already focused and calibrated lens here. So you need to adjust the infinity focus slightly. What you can do is take off the name ring, take off this ring, and then the filter ring, and then those 3 screws inside, you can loosen those once you've mounted this to a camera and figured out where the infinity focus is, and then loosen them, put this to infinity, and then tighten it, and then that's the new infinity. But that is it for this lens. Thank you for watching, and who knows, maybe I'll do some more videos on this.